Welcome to a special conversation today as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. My name is Randy Newcomb, and I'll be moderating this conversation with 5 of the previous High Commissioners. 75 years ago, on December 10th, 1948, 56 nations gathered, and with only 8 countries abstaining and none dissenting, the UDHR was adopted 3 years following the end of World War II and the nightmare of that conflict. Chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, a diverse committee of 18 members drafted and composed the entire text in less than 2 years. At a time when the divisions between Eastern and Western blocs were just beginning to harden, finding common ground in this declaration was an extraordinary feat that has rippled over generations. Joining us today are José Ayala-Lasso, Louise Arbour, Mary Robinson, Navi Pillay, and Zeid Hussein. I want to start our conversation today with some reflections on what you might offer on the promise of UDHR as we think about the next 75 years. In my reading of the history of this declaration, I was struck by the following comment from one of the members of the drafting committee, the Chilean delegate, Ambassador Santa Cruz, who, after the UDHR was adopted by the General Assembly, he wrote, "I perceived clearly that I was participating in a truly significant historic event in which a consensus had been reached as to the supreme value of the human person. In the Great Hall, there was an atmosphere of genuine solidarity among men and women from all latitudes." Of course, we find ourselves at a different moment, at a very difficult moment across the globe, both for human rights and for many parallel threats. And Navi, I want to start with you and ask you what kind of signs of promise or hope that perhaps even similar to the sentiment from the Chilean delegate you might be seeing where you are right now in South Africa. Navi?
Thank you very much, Randy, and my warm greetings to all my colleagues. It's wonderful to see you, especially Jose, whom I had not met before. So that's a great question to start with, Randy. As I grew up in apartheid South Africa, we look to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the standard of what good laws should be, good, fair laws, embracing equality and other rights. Because we were under oppressive laws, institutionalized racism, and so on. So to me, the UDHR continues to offer great promise because they're a set of time-tested values and standards. We continue to revere those standards. No state has withdrawn from the UDHR. They're all parties to it. The problem lies with implementation. And I should say that I have been speaking to very many students of late. And this is their question as well. Does the UDHR still have relevance when there's so little implementation by governments?
Thank you, Navi. Zeid, let me turn to you. And as you circulate and in our many conversations, oftentimes with younger individuals, what do you see as signs of promise and hope?
Well, you spoke of Hernan Santa Cruz's emphasis on the value of human life. P.C. Chang, another key author of the UDHR, spoke of the need to create in us a better human being. And given the threats that we face today, we all know we're capable of being better human beings, of recognizing all the faults within us and being sort of sensitive to what we could do better. And so the document is and remains both aspirational and essential, because it's hard to see ourselves as a civilization worthy of recognition if we can't basically connect ourselves, attach ourselves to the articles that were enumerated in the Universal Declaration. So it has within it hope, and it has within it aspiration, and it has within it a demand. Article 23.2 speaks of equal pay for equal work. How many corporate boards, how many businesses and organizations still need to meet that standard, and this was penned in 1946, 47, and then adopted in 48. So it's still extremely relevant and salient to the world today.
And I appreciate you called out this comment from Vice Chairman Chang. I have here in my notes, as you noted, he made this lovely comment. He said, laws alone are not sufficient to bring about results by themselves, but the declaration's main goal was to build up better human beings, which is just a beautiful comment and such an interesting reflection from the Chinese delegate at that time. Mary, let me ask you to come in on this question of hope. We happen to have been close to Archbishop Tutu, and he would often talk about himself as a prisoner of hope. And so what are your thoughts and reflections on this?
Thank you, Randy. I'm also very happy to be part of this conversation with some of my former colleagues whom I greet warmly. It is a little bit difficult to have hope just at the moment, given the very perilous times we're in. We have two very worrying wars, the war in Ukraine, the Israel war on Hamas, and we have forgotten conflicts. We have the existential threats that the elders focus on, the climate and nature crisis, nuclear weapons, and the pandemic crisis. And then we have the gross inequality in our world. I mean, a really gross inequality. And I think in many ways, where I see hope coming from is, yes, what Navi said, those who don't have the rights want them. And that's true all over the world, even in China, which is a little bit different because of the way in which the system has evolved. There are people who want more of their freedoms, more rights. And, those of us who can be in touch with individuals even know this, or artists or others. At the same time, I think part of how we rejuvenate and make relevant the Universal Declaration, and I agree with what my colleagues have said about it, is to move on from what the drafters were talking about. And I will quote again what you quoted, the value of the human person, the build better human beings, absolutely essential. But the problem was that the Universal Declaration posited us as human beings alone with rights. And I think maybe we need to rethink a little bit. First of all, I'm very taken by this movement for climate justice, which is rooted in human rights, rooted in science, rooted in the inequalities and injustices of how the climate shocks have come about. The richer world built its economy on fossil fuel and has caused these inequalities on poor countries and communities, gender inequality, intergenerational nature, etc. But actually, even beyond that, there is a real sense that we're not going to solve this problem unless we connect more with nature. So I'd like to take the Universal Declaration in all its strengths and all the things I love about it and link it to the fact that we need to be part of nature. We need to feel that. We need to see that we need the ecosystems that sustain us, and we need to be part of a climate justice movement. So, that's where I get hope at the moment, is that connection being made.
Let me ask you, Jose, what signs of promise and hope, similar to the sentiment from the Chilean delegate, might you be seeing?
Well, I think that the international atmosphere at the end of the World War, the Second World War, was really astonished and tired of all the destruction and the death caused by the war. So they decided to open up the possibilities of understanding, conversation, and dialogue among the nations to establish a new order of peace and security and of respect for human rights. That's why the International Universal Declaration of Human Rights was approved. And then let me remember that immediately after the Cold War started, and the International Declaration of Human Rights was affected by this Cold War. It is certain that the declaration is possible to be revised and composed in a better manner. But to open that possibility at the beginning of the Cold War was very problematic. So I think that the international Universal Declaration has survived up to now, and it is most appropriate to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the declaration.
Louise, I want to turn to you. You've had both working within the UN system, but also most certainly within civil society, having led significant civil society organizations and otherwise. And we're not only commemorating the 75th anniversary of the UDHR, but also the signing of the Genocide Convention. And I want to ask you this question around how you know these principles and standards that were created after World War II, they seem under threat. And so from where you sit, what is needed to defend these principles?
Well, thank you. And like others, I really welcome this opportunity to see my old friends again. I have to say, Randy, I was a little bit conflicted when I was trying to put myself in the right frame of mind for this conversation. You know, a 75th anniversary is normally worthy of celebration. And yet it's very difficult, I think, to, without sounding naive, to romanticize the progress we've made in 75 years. And I think Mary has described the very sorry state in which we find the world today. I think the human rights system, both as a set of principles, as a philosophy, and with implementing tools, the Office of the High Commissioner, the work of civil society, all that is profoundly interlinked with a lot of other parts of the working of our relationships, such as, you know, democracy, security, development, and prosperity, the recognition and celebration of our differences, as well as what unites us. All of this today, I think, is in a sorry state, and some of it in very severe turmoil. So to try to isolate what the human rights system or set of values promises is very difficult to do in isolation with the other parts. I think it's helpful actually to remember the time where this instrument, the Universal Declaration, was conceived, was developed, was articulated, and was embraced with so much hope. And I think there's no question hope is critical and essential when you need it. That is, when things are not going so well, and when you have to turn to the future as holding a lot of promises. Frankly, I think we are there, and I hope things are not going to get worse. See, the Universal Declaration came after a time, I think, of great unity, because the preceding catastrophe, tragedy of the Second World War was a time of great unity. Everybody was in it. And I think the need for hope and unity and solidarity was probably at its apex. Again, I like to think that, contrary to what I thought not so long ago, but when I was younger, I thought progress was linear. And I felt very privileged to be part of a movement, particularly the human rights movement, but writ large also the justice movement, that it was only getting better. It was getting better in my lifetime until, frankly, quite recently. So now I've changed my understanding, and I believe things are cyclical. They're not linear. Maybe that's the foundation of hope, or the foundation of some kind of comfort. The question is, how low are we in the wave, and are we going to be on the upswing pretty soon? So at this point, I can't think of an instrument better than the Universal Declaration to propel us forward. But at this point, I'm very conflicted about how much we have anchored and delivered in 75 years, and how much we can be really hopeful in the near and medium future.
Thank you. Yes, and I think that's shared by many of us. Jose, I want to turn to you on a question that you see beginning to emerge quite a bit. If you read the proceedings of the drafting committee, 1946, 1947, the notion of human rights wasn't conceived as a purely Western concept, but now we're increasingly seeing this idea that human rights is a Western concept, and that it doesn't have to be adopted in non-Western environments. And I'm curious, Jose, if you would have some reflections on this notion of human rights as purely a Western concept or not.
I have heard several times the idea that human rights was inspired by the Western philosophy. But there are many books, including some books written by Eastern philosophers, who said that the principles embodied in the Universal Declaration belong to the most important monotheistic religions of the world. And so there is a philosophy which is shared by all human beings. The Romans had the idea of to live with honesty, to give to each other what corresponds to each other, and not to hurt anybody. Well, those principles are very general, and the principles embodied in Universal Declaration are, in my opinion, sufficiently general as to correspond to the beliefs of the whole world, and at the same time, the basis for cultural varieties in application of those principles.
Let me turn to some others on this question. Zeid, I've heard you talk about this idea of human rights as just purely a Western concept and this notion that's beginning to emerge. Do you have some comments on this?
This was debated in UNESCO in 1947 when the philosophical survey was sent out to 70 thinkers, among whom was Mahatma Gandhi and several Confucian thinkers as well. And the report that was put together eventually concluded that there's so much so much overlap in the historic and spiritual traditions that the idea that this is a Western contrivance, there could be parts of it that could well be seen as that, but in overall terms, there isn't a historic or spiritual tradition, for instance, that supports tyranny or an unjust rule. So there's a fair amount of overlap. This cultural relativism argument really gained steam about 30 years ago, and the infection spread from various parts of Asia beyond that. But I think all of us who've been working in the field, and here you have high commissioners who've basically maintained a position of moral consistency. And the moral consistency comes from a reliance on a set of standards and values that have proven themselves over time, a distillation of human suffering and experience, the lessons of which are borne out in this document and in further legal documents. And so I'm afraid I'm not someone who buys into that. Someone else once said, and I completely subscribe to the position, that when you speak to those who survive the most appalling human rights violations, those who are disadvantaged, those who are beyond the remit of social and legal protections, and you ask them about this issue, they know they're being victimized and discriminated against. They don't need to. They will never say that their culture allows for this. It's only those governments and those who are supporting a policy of elite capture of the state, of a dominance of one group over another, that would make such arguments in the main. So I think one can quite easily put to bed most of that. There are some areas where you can make the argument that the normative edge is something more. It has more of a warm embrace in the global north than the so-called global south. That can be made, but in the main, I think we accept that the values are universal.
I think that's right, but I have two problems with that. The first one is that I think the claim or the skepticism vis-a-vis this idea that this is all a Western agenda is that even though the values may be universal, like all of you, I've never met anybody on earth who, if given the opportunity to subscribe to one of these rights, would say, no, I don't think I'm interested in that. But that's, I think, nowhere near nor there. The real issue is that the West, I think, in its promotion of these values, has happily been the beneficiary of the fact that it always coincided with its interests. And that, I think, has generated a lot of skepticism. And of course, the accusations of double standards. that in their applications, these rights, I think, have been, let's put it this way, some with powers have been more forgiving of the sins of others. So the application has been the subject of a lot of double standards. But I think more profoundly, Zeid, where I would think we have a problem is when allegedly these rights conflict with one another. Freedom of religion and gender equality, freedom of religion and freedom of expression. And it's at the confine of conflicting rights that I think cultural specificity and so on enters the fray, and it's not quite as straightforward, I think, as and it doesn't serve the cause for some to embrace, for instance, freedom of expression as absolute almost, even if it's at the cost, for instance, of equality. So should there be limits to such rights, hate propaganda? There are very genuine differences of opinion. So if we stay at a high level of generality, I think we have a lot of consensus. When we start getting a little more granular, that's where cultural specificity, I think, complicates the matter.
Louise is undoubtedly right. Yeah, she's undoubtedly right, and you will always come into these areas of human rights though where you have tension. When I was meeting the indigenous people of a country in South America, and they were claiming their rights against the duty bearer, the state itself. It was also clear that within their culture, within their community, they were treating women in a way that wouldn't be acceptable, right? And so you're one and the same, you're claiming rights from the state, and at the same time, you're practicing a tradition which is harmful to other human beings. So what do we say? We say, well, we support your claim before the state for your indigenous rights. That we support. But within the context of your own culture, you need to find a way to dialogue the harm that's being done to other people out of the system, whether it's to women, to persons with disabilities, to LGBTI, whoever they may be. And it's the same in the religious context. You can dialogue it out. But the tensions that Louise spoke of is absolutely correct. I mean, the general, we can make harmony very easily, but there are real problems that need to be discussed. But there is a way, I think, that we can do it. So long as no harm is being done to other human beings, we can do this.
Navi, let me ask you to come in on that. I think if any country has been on the receiving end of a double standard, perhaps South Africa is one of the leading. And what are your thoughts on this notion of human rights as purely a Western concept?
That's not my view, but I take that criticism seriously because I continue to hear that from very angry young people on my continent. Firstly, they're the ones raise this question that these are Western concepts because it focuses on individual rights rather than community rights. That's why you can have all this free gun licensing going on to individuals, whereas the community suffers. But back into our context, the fact is the world is growing, the rich are growing richer and richer, and the poor are getting poorer. How can that be 75 years after a Universal Declaration of Human Rights? So that's why it's not relevant to them, because it does not address root causes that affect people in developing countries, which also includes colonialism, slavery before that, colonialism, neo-colonialism. These are the matters they want to discuss and seek a full discussion and reparation. And unfortunately, the Western world has stifled a conversation on those key issues. For instance, in the Durban conference and review conference on racism, people were not allowed to raise these key issues that affect them. So that's the main complaint, that it's Western oriented. It benefits rich people rather than addressing this huge gap in poverty. And there the UDHR has failed to deliver on the expectations of ordinary people.
We had such good discussions in Durban. We also had terrible marches of anti-Semitism in the street. I mean, it was very raw because the South African public saw the link with what was happening in Israel-Palestine, as people do now. And in fact, now we see that the crime of apartheid is being committed by Israel in the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, that's what Israel human rights defenders and former ambassadors and former military leaders said to us, that actually we're sorry, but in what's happening with this right-wing government and Jewish supremacy and grabbing as never before land, this is apartheid. This amounts to the crime of apartheid as identified in the International Criminal Court statute. And what I think is important is to recognize, as Navi said, there is this real sense now of a divide that has opened up because of the gross inequality, because of a failure to come to terms with post-colonial, post-slavery issues. We tried in Durban. I mean, there were some very good discussions, I have to say, and we centered victims. Victims are very much centered. There was a great victims pavilion that was the center of a lot of the discussion in Durban, and we succeeded in getting the conference. But 3 days later, you had the attacks of 9/11, and the whole conference was completely dismissed. And Navi, you followed me, and you had to pick up the pieces on a total unwillingness to even admit that the conference had been successful. I mean, it was an amazing kind of thing. I think we need to understand the very difficult times we're in, and that human rights has to be on the side of those who are on the margins, those who are in poverty, those who are, and be very clear about truth to power. I know you want to possibly come on to this, Randy, but I feel very strongly we tolerate far too much. Even we tolerate state capture now by corporations of so much of the wealth of countries. We have to get back to the basics of human rights and the basics of equality and the basics of linking then with nature, as I say, and with tackling the existential crisis that we're facing that can bring us together. I have great hopes that a climate justice movement may help to regenerate human rights in a very real sense, and women's rights in particular, and women's leadership.
Some of the challenges of an 80-year-old body represented by the UN, and the challenges of that body then keeping up with these new challenges that Mary, you've identified. How do we think about climate justice? How do we think about the next generation? How do we think about a future that is probably far more female and far more young? And how do we begin to interact in those spaces? So I'm curious what your thoughts might be around how does this 80-year-old body begin to transform itself to meet the challenges of the next 75 years? Zeid, I've heard you talk about this. Would you be willing to come in on that?
It's of course a good question because the organization is clearly feeling pressure. The peacemaking function is not working very well. The human rights function is still operating. The High Commissioner has been making strong statements on the whole, the Israel's war on Hamas, or Hamas's war on Israel. And the special procedures are working. There was a meeting of the session of the Human Rights Council that's still operating. I think the essential point is moral consistency. The way in which the Global South, and I come from a country in the Global South, throws this accusation against the global countries of the Global North when they practice it just as badly. I mean, there is no country that I have seen that is utterly morally consistent. If you look at the voting records across the continents, they're not. And so it's only the independent bodies really within the UN and other civil society organizations that can be and that try to be. And that's why I think the preservation is so essential. And if we can deal with the fundamental problems that all the former high commissioners have spoken of, the deep-seated inequality, the state capture by a certain number of families, for instance, in many, many countries that seem to run everything and that are supported by the multinationals and supported by the OECD countries. And then you can't escape from that seeming position. We, the peoples, are only being supported by the narrow human rights pillar. The other parts of the human system, of the UN system, is very much on the side of the state. Whether the state is a threat to the rights of its people or a guarantor, or both, as is often the case, is immaterial. The UN will support the position of the state, by and large. And it's the independent sort of bodies and the human rights pillar that tries to give some sort of voice to the other side. And it's not that we, will speak on behalf of the violent actions of extremism, although all of us have been accused of having done so because we look at the conduct itself as opposed to the authorship of the conduct or the nationality or the position. And so we're accused of that. But I think we can all say that as High Commissioners, the guide that we have used always is the UDHR and the 2 international covenants and the other treaties that flow from that. And I think if we are to give any hope to the youth, it's to show that they can be courageous too. They can speak out, as all of us have seen in many occasions. When young people speak out and say things when no one else is prepared to say them, it has an astonishing effect. And so we have to keep believing.
Thank you, Zeid. I think that is so important. And one of the, perhaps all of you will share this same level of anxiety, having been high commissioners, but it's this question that, Mary, you referenced earlier about speaking truth to power. And it's the tension I'm sure you can speak to around the mandate to speak truth to power, but also you rely upon these very governments for your very legitimacy and that mandate to do just that. So I'm curious, just in the practice of your work, how it is that you balance this question of speaking truth to power among those same governments that you depended upon for your legitimacy.
Well, I want to pick up on things that Mary has said already, the hypocrisy and double standards. We have to confront that. So the youth will pick it up, but we are in positions of authority here where we must confront that. So now let me give you a couple of practices that goes on amongst member states, and we just politely acquiesce instead of demanding an explanation. For instance, in the human rights side events, where the High Commissioner chairs meetings, when the issues are related to civil and political rights, the West dominates that room. They pack there because they're so comfortable that we're discussing violations in faraway places, away from their backyards. But when it comes to a discussion on civil and political rights or issues such as migrants, the rights of migrants, the hall is empty of Western diplomats and their mission representatives. It's developing countries. I see that as such a dangerous divide. All these member states have sworn to uphold the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I've often, let it go. But I think I would encourage even us retired high commissioners, but also the current high commissioners, to follow this practice that has now been developed in respect of the use of the veto, that one of the P5s using the veto in the Security Council has to come before the General Assembly and explain their vote. I would like to see some kind of measure where we get states to explain why they are boycotting discussions on economic, social, and cultural rights, which are so crucial for developing countries and the lives of migrants, many other issues that they do not attend. And of course, then you get the other group that will not attend when you're discussing LGBTI rights. So once again, I think we have to demand explanations now instead of just accepting their stay away. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going back to the approach that high commissioners have to take, and I think we're the part of the UN that has to be guided by the first three words of the Charter: "We the peoples," not the role of states. And I think that's been one of the hallmarks of high commissioners, to try to speak to states. It's our job to speak truth to states, and I think this needs not only to continue, but I think it needs to be supported by other members of the Human Rights Council, as Navi said. I actually agree with the point she's making about calling out states for failure to show up, and I think failure to show up also in the the injustice of the who's responsible for the climate shocks that the poorest countries and communities are suffering, and the failure to really get real about loss and damage and get real about adaptation. I mean, it's the same story, and it needs the same kind of calling out. Who is responsible? Polluters pay, and also who has the capacity to be able to make the changes and must make the changes in cutting emissions, etc. We're going to see this in COP28. It's going to be very interesting to see whether, in the context of the worst year for heat, the hottest year ever, more climate shocks, more suffering of the poorest countries, whether anything is going to move. That's where I believe the climate justice movement, grounded in human rights, can reinvigorate the call out of truth to power somehow. It's in that wider context, and the wider context of being closer to nature and seeing ourselves not as neoliberal individuals. And I think we need to go back to Article 29 of the Universal Declaration. I have one always handy. I take one around in my purse, as I've said. I always have it. And why do we not make more of everyone has duties to the community, in which alone the free and full development of, and I'm going to make it gender sensitive, his or her personality is possible? That's not a Western concept. That we have duties to community without which we don't reach our full personality. That's a real way of trying to say, we need to have that community sense and duty sense, as well as understanding the importance of recognizing human rights and the equality between human beings and so on.
I decided to take contact with all the leaders of the world, most of them, in order to promote the political importance of the Office of High Commissioner. Let's remember that in my time, it was possible to get into an agreement for the creation of the High Commissioner office after 50 years of being silent about this initiative taken in the 50s of last century by the government of Uruguay. So I said, there are especially non-governmental organizations and even the Council of Human Rights, which were criticizing, announcing violations, fighting against violations. I decided to promote the dialogue, to go to the governments who violate human rights and make a policy of results in my action. And that produced results. I went to Cuba and I obtained the liberation of some of the political prisoners and the acceptance of the pacts of civil and political rights and social, economic, and cultural rights. So it was the way I considered necessary to act. At the same time, I thought that the technical assistance by the multilateral organization, the organizations of the United Nations especially, was absolutely necessary. In 1994, there were 2 programs of technical assistance by the Office of Human Rights in Geneva. When I left my office, we had 400 programs of assistance, technical assistance, to promote human rights. I thought that was the good approach.
I'm afraid we have to draw this conversation to a close, and I want to thank you for everybody for joining us here. Mary, as you reflect on those comments, I was inspired to read one of Eleanor Roosevelt's last speeches before the UN, and she emphasized this community, or as she called it, the small settings and the small places. And I recall that she asked this question rhetorically: where, after all, do universal human rights begin? She responded, in small places, close to home, so close and so small they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood they live in, the school or college they attend, the factory, farm, or office where they work. So on behalf of the hundreds, if not thousands of people who will be watching this conversation online in major cities and small villages around the world, I want to thank you for your leadership as High Commissioners and for sustaining the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, now in its 75th year, in the grand spaces and the small places. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Randy.